Good evening, and welcome to tonight's keynote address, The Stories That Connect Us. Our presenters, Joe Mageary, Colleen O'Neal, and Patricia McDonough Ryan, will share their work in creating trauma-sensitive healing spaces for children living through crisis. Joe?
Thank you. And thanks to the entire LIFTS team, and good evening and welcome to everyone. We are thrilled to be here chatting with you, and we're grateful for the invitation from the LIFTS team. My name is Joe Mageary. I am an associate professor and department chair of counseling and psychology here at Lesley. I guess while I'm expressing some gratitude, I also want to, express gratitude to my two co-presenters here. This is the fifth time that the three of us have shared meeting space just this week, and the dedication of my colleagues is commendable, and it's a pleasure to work with you both. So if I may just turn it over to each of you to do a quick intro. Perhaps Colleen?
5 times wasn't enough, Joe. I'm Colleen O'Neal. I'm an associate professor of school psychology at the College of Education at University of Maryland. And I study immigrant and refugee student and teacher resilience and prevention.
I'm Patricia McDonough Ryan, and I am a pediatric neuropsychologist and do clinical work at Gaylord Center for Brain Health and at UConn, and with a lab called Empower in New Haven, Connecticut, in refugee resettlement for refugees and recent arrivals in our Connecticut area.
Thank you both. So we're here to talk about a theme, the stories that connect us. And we'll begin our slideshow now. So who we are, you've heard, and we first met in this beautiful Italian hillside community in central Italy, a town called Orvieto. I took this picture myself with my phone one morning, and it's sort of the most majestic place you can be. But we convened there for a rather serious purpose, and that was as part of the Harvard program in refugee trauma. It's Global Mental Health and Refugee Trauma Certificate that is interdisciplinary and attracts people from all over the globe to talk about really what it is to create healing environments and trauma sensitivity and trauma-informed care in many, many environments. We've worked with some of our cohort colleagues were in global policy. Others, there was one person who was a forensic odontologist, another who is a former NBA referee, and then folks who are psychologists, expressive therapists, educators. And we came together to learn about the Harvard model, which we'll talk a little bit about in bits and pieces, but it really has been infused into our work. So we met in 2019, and our work through the program went into 2020. And then, hey, guess what? Things kind of got disrupted around 2020. And then the unfortunate reality of this work is that hard things continue to happen. And so through my connection to Lesley, I was in communication with Sal and Joe and Patricia and the LIFTS program. And as the Russian aggression in Ukraine commenced in 2022, we began meeting weekly with a group of educators and psychologists supporting kids in the context of war. And as our work in those meetings deepened, it became clear that we needed additional expertise. And so reaching out to the HPRT network allowed us to bring in Trish and Colleen to really breathe important life into this work. So what we'll be talking about today, not only are our professional connections, the three of us here, but the connections to the work that we have done and are doing with the with the teachers, with the psychologists who are supporting kids in Ukraine. So the Vela project is sort of the umbrella, that supports connecting us with the Ukrainian colleagues that we meet with every week. And here's just a quick screen grab from their webpage, and the link there it will take you to the homepage. And so there are a lot of resources. This is obviously the English translation of the website, but there is the Ukrainian translation as well. And our weekly Zoom meetings get recorded and posted. And as we do different projects with folks, the information is spread and archived on this website here. So since we've been working together for almost 2 years now, it's getting to be quite an archive. And so we'll share with you a little bit of what has come out of it in our conversation this evening. So just real quick, here are the points we're going to touch upon. I won't bother to read this list to you because we'll get to each of these points, but just you have a sense of where we're going with our time together tonight. And hopefully by the end, we'll have some points for you to ponder and maybe some time for a question and answer as well. But these are the directions we're going. So this very first point of connection and disconnection. A phrase kind of popped up in one of our conversations that distress is isolating and isolation is distressing. And if you think about as simple of a statement as that is, and in fact, trauma both isolates and distresses. So if someone is in a wartime context, as one example of trauma, it is not just a one-time event, obviously. It is prolonged, it can be ambiguous, it can be direct, and it can be unclear as to when anything will end or change or go away. And so in our work with our Ukrainian colleagues, these are some of the active questions. How to continue to educate and support children while having to quite literally pause a lesson and usher the class to an underground bomb shelter for an indeterminate amount of time until the air raid warning ends. So while it is true in general that distress is isolating and isolation is distressing, we have taken this up in our work and really used this notion of connection as whether it be a goal or a helpful process, or really a sort of guiding frame to the work that we do. How can we foster experiences of connection, opportunities for connection, and ideas for other ways to get connected, stay connected to people, to places, to the environment, to tradition, to anything that can bring meaning. Because as Viktor Frankl most famously talked about, it is meaning that can really help us build resilience through hard times. So some of the ways that we have sown this in, they can be quite simple, and I hear Trisha's voice in this quote, "You are not alone." We'll talk about why that is. Trish is the person oftentimes who ends our weekly meetings, and that is a phrase that she intentionally says, "You are not alone." And that shared expectation of routine and familiar, meaningful phrases, it's all part of the framework of what we can do to help to build a felt sense of connection. So there's a same beginning and end to each of our meetings. Gratitude is a piece of it as well. And also, we have really worked to encourage the folks who come to our meetings to prioritize self-care. And I'm going to actually interject and say, we encourage the folks who show up, but we've also found that a far greater number of people in Ukraine are watching the recordings of the videos that are posted on that VELA website than are able to attend. Some of that is because the time of day, not everybody can make time in what is sort of mid-afternoon for them. But also some of it is just the disruptions that come along with living in a war zone. Some people miss a week because the power was out, or an air raid happened to, a siren went off at a time when we were supposed to meet. So the recordings themselves, not only are they sort of a repository of the work, but they are the connection that folks who cannot synchronously be with us can share. So if folks are going to be supporting children, students, whether it be as psychologists or in the classroom as teachers, first things first. You got to put your air mask on yourself before you can assist others, as that sort of airplane cliche goes, right? So it's also an interesting point of cultural difference that we found, where here in a Leslie environment in particular, processing, self-care, talking about our experiences, asking questions, dialogue, engaging. This is all part of sort of what's woven into the fabric of how we learn and create. And we've been shown and actually told at times explicitly by some of our Ukrainian colleagues that it is a sign of respect in Ukraine to not ask questions, because if I've asked questions, then that might be an indicator that I wasn't listening. So if you're not asking questions, you're also not identifying your own need. So we are using the exercises, gearing it towards helping children, but also saying you need to do this work yourself, and here's why. So some of the activities we talked about, and we'll get into some of them today: the Tree of Life, the Well-Being Flower, music, storytelling, animal yoga, kind of fun stuff. So this is a point where I think I will pass over to my colleague, Colleen.
Hello. We want to share some of the deeper thinking that came from the Refugee Trauma and Recovery Program. And by deeper thinking, I mean like the concept of there is no healing without beauty. And I think that this can apply to psychology, school psychology, work in the classroom, and beyond, and in the context of trauma and healing. And if you're interested, this came from Dr. Richard Malika, who's head of the program we were in. Also, it's very interdisciplinary. So Dr. Elaine Scarry, Scarry, is a philosopher, and we don't often get the opportunity to read philosophy in our work, but she has taken the notion of beauty and even healing and art to a different level for me, and interacts with this idea of healing being dependent on the element of beauty. So in order to move on from trauma, the thinking is that you need beauty. And it's not necessarily the typical idea of beauty. The idea is that you, whether you're in school or a psychologist or more, can help facilitate their sense of agency to find beauty again. And connection with others is a form of beauty. So let's say if you're a refugee child, you can come in and maybe there's a garden that you create at the school. And that is done with others. And that helps them gain a sense of agency, especially if they have a unique role in creating that garden. And so that's a shared experience, would be an example of finding beauty again, working together. And awe, I'll talk a little bit about, comes from a connection with others and can come from beauty. You can find out more on that link also that was in there about this notion of healing, no healing without beauty. So awe, this is like a moment for me of awe in the classroom. Like sunsets can be a moment of awe, and a teacher brought this moment in a classroom. This would give me pause, and if I walked in that classroom. So let me just talk about how it's been conceptualized. It can be a sense of wonder, but it's not simply a sense of wonder. It's hard to put words to awe, especially like if you've experienced it. An easy way to tell that you feel awe sometimes is like a tingly feeling, but it doesn't have to be simply that. It can't just be wonder. It can be the sense of a vastness, like a feeling of your experience being larger than oneself, of it being out of your ordinary experience. And it needs a conceptual shift that, at least in school psychology and working with teachers in schools, this notion of a conceptual shift, is like your typical way of thinking. And then all of a sudden it's eye-opening, you think about it differently. So you can think of it like Piaget's thinking around accommodation of, your typical way of thinking. So it can also give you a sense of meaning, which if you're recovering from trauma, meaning is really important. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out, okay, I've been through this impactful experience. Where is my sense of meaning now? And you could think of it as a compass for what matters. When you feel a sense of awe, you're like, oh my gosh, wait, what is it about this experience that tells me what is important to me? And like I'm saying, when you're in a dark place, sometimes people go in search of awe. And sometimes they call it flavors of awe. And for example, like beauty-based awe, like going to the Grand Canyon. However, it can be a mix of fear. Like for me, if I went to the Grand Canyon, I'd be like, wow, the Grand Canyon's beautiful. I'm shifting my way of thinking. Life is larger and I'm more connected with people. However, it's a cliff and I'm scared of heights, and the beauty is really dependent on these cliffs that go way down to a river. But that enhances the feeling of awe too. So biggest source of awe is a connection with other people. Like if I were with my family looking at the Grand Canyon, and all of us experience an elevation and an awe, and beauty too. Collective awe. We're very excited about this idea. So for the three of us, we felt awe for each other's work. And you can think of that as a collective awe. And for the work that we're doing together and contributing together. And for the synergy in these moments, sometimes very goofy, like improvisatory thinking, that synergy and the electrical, connection, it sort of creates a sense of awe too. And we also feel similarly towards the refugees and immigrants with whom we work. And we don't mean awe in how some people use it, where we're like, let's put them up on a pedestal and think that, oh, they're perfect. It's a sense of connection and understanding deeply, or trying to, what's going on. And with refugees, I think that some of the experience that we have, and at least the work directly with refugees in my experience, awe can lead you to, biologically, as Trish will discuss, even have your hearts in sync. So biologically, all of a sudden, before you experience a sense of awe, synergy, connection together, your hearts are not in sync, but after, research has found they're actually in sync. And that you can think of as collective awe too. Now there's this idea of collective effervescence, where feels bubbly almost to me, where it's like, for example, it doesn't have to be religious, an experience of awe, but praying with the people with whom I work, who are refugees, often who come from persecuted environments like Myanmar, where because of their religion, they're persecuted. And so they flee, but they pray together often after fleeing. They sing together, they can move together. And they often do this in schools that are for refugees, where I work, both in the US, but I'm talking about in Malaysia, where people from Myanmar, Afghanistan, and other places flee. And they have refugee schools that are hidden. I could talk about more, but it's a tight community, and often they move together and experience learning together that perhaps when you've walked into a school before, there's this collective effervescence, like among preschoolers. They're all excited, moving around. So I just want to give a brief example of awe as a political act of resistance. So even if, like, I went to the Women's March in Washington, and we were all moving together, and it was even like, oh wow, this is crowded. I was a little like, had a moment of fear, and then someone played RESPCT, right? Respect. And it was a moment of collective effervescence and awe, and my fear sort of lifted. So one teacher with whom I worked in, collaborated with in Malaysia, was a refugee herself, teaching refugees. And she was from Myanmar, and she was Christian. And in Myanmar, Christians are actually oppressed, along with Muslim or Hindu. And she, in school, described how she would be forced to do a Buddhist prayer. It's a Buddhist majority, military junta who's in charge there, forced to do a Buddhist prayer where she would be leaning down, not wanting to do that kind of prayer because she was Christian, and they would physically push her down to force her to pray. And she wouldn't, she would fight it. And that was an act of resistance that I feel awe for. And perhaps after the fact, there was a sense of, I hope, the virtue-based, the strength-based kind of flavor of awe. And she was motivated to teach refugees because she wanted to have a more healing, different kind of education for them, regardless of their religion. You can learn more about this notion of awe, all the research and deep thinking around it, from Dr. Docker Kelter, and you can use this link to learn more.
I'm going to have you shift gears for just a moment and consider what is happening from a neurological standpoint to kids that you could be working in, the reason why you're attending this conference and these classes this week on creating a trauma-informed, sensitive environment, and thinking of the whole child. And in thinking of the whole child, we need to think of what's happening from a neurological basis in kiddos, in your classrooms, for us, in the children that we work in with refugee resettlement, in the classrooms Colleen and Joe are in, and then in Ukraine, the kiddos as they're in the classroom, as Joe mentioned, in the bomb shelters, in the environments where they're living in remote villages, and we need to get to them. And how do we do that? So this framework of understanding what is happening beneath the hood, so to speak, in kiddos as they develop, and what trauma does to that. And keeping this in this whole context that Joe and Colleen have been talking about in connections. And if you remember, our brain develops from the back, going back to your brainstem, to the front. So we mature in the sense of the connections that are happening neurologically, the neural pathways that happen as a result of nature. So we're starting from a biological integrity of your system, your capacity of that system, of what it is in utero and at birth, and that comes from the genetics and other aspects that could happen in utero, to then the nurture that can happen in the environment, and positive input from the environment, age-appropriate input, and hygiene factors such as nutrition and sleep. And when you think of these connections that are happening from the back of the brain, from the brain stem, think of little infants of basic instincts, to the frontal system of higher order complex abilities. And across that network from brainstem to the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, your temporal and frontal lobes, and parietal lobes, there are critical networks that are formed. And as a result of trauma, whether it's acute trauma or chronic trauma, there's interruption to these connections. Next slide, Joe. So when we consider how does trauma interfere with this brain construction and the connections that happen, and what does it mean to have interruptions in these circuits? And what it means is either the absence of growing into those critical skills that different lobes, so to speak, or different parts of the brain host as the child develops, and as a stagnation, meaning just not continuing to grow, skills kind of pause. That can happen as a result of trauma directly and indirectly in terms of lack of exposure. So you think of COVID, and in all the classrooms that you may work in, you've noticed a stagnation, right? So kids did not develop the skills, and that comes from stagnation and development. And in our trauma and in our conflict zones that we work in, kids are not attending school because their schools are bombed out, or because they're in shelters and can't get up into the classroom. So this interference that happens from a cognitive perspective, and thinking of those neural connections that create our attention, our encoding to new learning abilities, our language systems, our decision-making and problem-solving abilities, to the social skills that kids develop in terms of pro-social behaviors and functioning, and creating secure attachments, emotional regulation, emotional expanding your repertoire. And what happens in the context of trauma is kids have developed what's called a restricted repertoire, meaning they only will be used to and experience and express fewer emotions, and that repertoire becomes smaller and smaller with time. And in terms of movement. And so when we think of what's going on beneath the hood in these kiddos, and think of it from the context from the individuals we work with in Ukraine, are everywhere from the preschool leaders to the high school and young adults who are working in migration camps with thousands of kids and individuals who've moved across the country to flee the war. How do we work with them and consult with them to keep this framework in their context as they're trying to provide education, as they're trying to provide social experiences and connections with their kids? And then how do they, as a community of leaders and teachers and educators, stay connected with each other? So on this next slide, what's something to consider that we take into context is, how do we cultivate, how do we create, how do we grow neural connections? And one example is, we think of it early in the war, we provided this notion of, okay, these are 5 things you want to think about every day. Whether it's you do this in your classroom or you provide education to parents on what's going to reduce the impact of these disconnections that are happening as a result of trauma or stagnation. How can we continue to develop as much as we can the brain during this really tragic time? And one is creating opportunities for attachment, for kids to create and nurture healthy attachment. In Ukraine, most of the men have gone off to war. Siblings have gone off to war. Kids have lost sources of attachment. Teachers become another source of attachment. So exposure to healthy touch as appropriate, affirmations of you are loved, you matter, being seen, I see you today, I know where you are, I know what's going on, you matter to me. And that engages those healthy attachments that are critical. To movement and coordination from that back, remember I talked about the back to the front. If you want to activate the front, A great way to do it is activate the back of the brain, activating that cerebellum to help form connections to the front of the brain, which then can help with gross and fine motor advancements and attention and other activations that are necessary for higher order thinking. Our third is creating opportunities to regulate your central nervous system and teaching a unified collective classroom on how to do butterfly breathing, whether they're in a shelter underground or they are in a remote village or in a family system, how you create and regulate breathing to control your central nervous system. Expanding an emotional repertoire to then creating pro-social behaviors. And this is where awe comes into play. So Colleen mentioned, well, why is awe so important? Well, it's really important from my perspective when I look at it neurobiologically, because what awe does is it activates your frontal system. Awe creates connections neurodevelopmentally, and it actually happens to help pro-social behavior. So the research on the next slide, Joe, the research really indicates that if you want to really create a beautiful, strong neural network from the back of the brain to the front and engage in these high fives, and then you weave awesomeness and awness into that, you can have a beautiful outcome. And that is what healing through beauty means from a neurodevelopmental perspective, from a neurobiology perspective. So what we see when we put scans of people, when we look at the scans of people who go into an imaging device, and we look at what parts of the brain are being activated when they experience a moment of awe, they actually are activating that frontal circuit. And they're activating more pro-social behavior. So why is that? So what is pro-social behavior? Pro-social behavior is my interest in people outside of me. And honest, when it's done by looking at somebody doing something really beautiful for another person, is much more powerful than honest that's created by individual time in nature. If you think of John Krasinski during the COVID, and Joe brought this up, that there's another next chapter that we're going to be doing possibly with our Ukraine folks, in them creating a show similar to that, where he connected us through awe. So he gave us examples of, look at this beautiful work that someone is doing someplace else as an act of kindness. And we would experience an awe, and that awness would open and ignite our brain. And when you have time, we don't today, but we're giving you these slides. You can go back to this particular slide and click on the chimpanzee who escaped from the zoo in Ukraine. So early on, when we were trying to create some connectiveness between our team and Ukraine, we shared awe by looking at how this chimp escaped from the zoo, and how the zookeeper went, and the chimp ran to the zookeeper's arms, and she hugged this chimp, and then she put a raincoat on the chimp, and you could hear them saying "ah" over in Ukraine amid this horrific war, and us embracing them with "we're with you together." So go ahead back to the slide when you get a chance later, and go through these questions for yourself. Of at what point in the video does awe induce? What is, and when awe is induced, and where do you see beauty? So bringing beauty and awe together, and where do you notice this in your body? Next slide, Joe. And another way that we do it in the classroom and in Ukraine and in the shelters is through creating this awe that kids become very excited about, as well as adults, we're noticing, and around animals and animal yoga and butterfly breathing, and how they create what we are going to build ourselves into by the end of our discussion today, this ecosystem that connects us, and how you can create this ecosystem. So I'm going to shift back to Joe, who's going to take you through an exercise called the Tree of Life. and how that tree of life is another way at a time when the folks in Ukraine were feeling so disconnected that they felt connection and they felt awe with each other and activated this system and brought greater attention and cognitive abilities to themselves in their classrooms. Joe?
Thanks, Trish. You mentioned butterfly breathing a couple of times. What do you think about taking, 20 seconds here to do a quick little butterfly breath so we can all know what it's like?
Sure. I was going to do it at the end.
Oh,
so you
okay.
go. Yeah.
All right. Sounds great. So the tree of life. What you're seeing here is a slide from the website at the bottom, and the announcement that's written here, this is part of the announcement, was what was put out by our Ukrainian colleagues for a project that we all sort of co-created for Earth Day, this most recent Earth Day. And you can see that they, in the sort of third paragraph there, they talk about the action of the International Association based on this Tree of Life project. So Tree of Life is something that comes from narrative therapy. There was a Zimbabwean narrative therapist and an Australian narrative therapist who collaborated on working with kids who were forcibly displaced, who were either internally displaced or seeking refugee status outside of their own homes, and applying the principles of narrative therapy, in which we talk about the social construction of meaning and identity. They developed this arts-based project that was applied to working with kids, but has actually been applied to working with all kinds of folks all around the world. So it seemed like a pretty good fit for the work we were doing. And so we started to, this was really one of the first times that we shifted into a project-based focus in our meetings. So we'll do didactic, informational sessions, we'll have some dialogue, and we come to projects like this Tree of Life. So we'll walk you through the steps in a moment, but just to say, this advertisement went out for Earth Day, and similarly, the regional Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine, encouraged folks all across the country to try this out with the students and the kids that they were working with, and it also became an international effort where we reached out to our own colleagues and kind of spread the word. They reached out to their colleagues, and we ended up having well over 1,000 participants who submitted drawings like this, or who did it in small groups with family members, with teachers from all around the world, Canada, from Ukraine, from the United States, from a kind of an impressive list of countries. And for the folks who are in Ukraine, it connects to the work and the ideas that Colleen and Trish were just talking about. For the folks who were, say, in Canada and in the US, it allows for that sense of shared meaning. You are not alone. In fact, here we are co-creating this project together, and it becomes a forest of life when we can put them all together. So the website, again, is linked at the bottom of the screen there. There's all kinds of examples from around the world of people who participated in the Tree of Life project here. So if you happen to have materials available to you now, I encourage you to, we're going to take a few minutes and walk through the steps. Ideally, you'd have probably 90 minutes to be able to get into the spirit, to be able to really think about the different pieces, to be able to actually do the art and the construction of the tree, pick out the colors. Maybe some people cut out the leaves, and however intricate you'd like to be. If you have that voice whispering in your ear, but I'm not an artist, A, I recommend and encourage you to challenge that. But B, you can use something like what's on the page here. This template of a tree has all the pieces that you need. And it would be a matter of doing similar to what you see on the previous slides, writing in words. So the Tree of Life project goes like this: draw a tree, pick a tree. And as you go through the different parts, we start to utilize them as metaphor. So in the roots, write down words that describe where you come from. And again, if you have a piece of paper right now, even if you want to make a little list or type it onto your computer, feel free. Words that represent your culture, your country, your favorite foods, however you define where you come from. If you don't have a piece of paper, just notice where it brings you. And we're going to move probably faster through this than would feel comfortable, but notice if you have a list that's longer than you can write down now. Moving to the trunk of your tree, however you want to artistically note it, note your skills and abilities. What do you like to do? What are you good at doing? What are you known for? At least if you want to be known for it. Now, if you're like me, as I'm thinking about the things I like to do, I'm starting to think of stories and people. I'm starting to think of the people I do these things with, the times that were really good, have been great. And that's part of the point. See, we're starting to build these connections, even to people who may not be with us anymore. Now, in the branches of your tree, what are your goals? What do you hope for? What do you wish for? And as you can see on the slide, wishes for yourself, for others, for the world. I'm about to shift the slide. Before I do, I want to point out at the bottom here, if you really want to dig into this Tree of Life activity beyond what we share with you, that link gives you everything you need to know from the folks who actually created the Tree of Life project. So continuing upward in your tree, if you're drawing, you can make any types of leaves you like, any colors, whether they be the autumn colors that we have here in New England, or if you want purple or magenta, pink, green, anything at all. In those leaves, write the names of anyone who's important to your tree. And maybe that comes from some of the stories that are bubbling up as you're doing this activity. It's almost like the nutrients that are feeding the beauty of the leaves. And if you're like me, there's a lot of folks I could write down. And for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving along. So in the template image, there's already ground drawn in. However you would care to do this, now you add the ground. And that you can write down what you can do today, what you can do for yourself, for your community. Maybe it ties into the wishes, the hopes. Maybe it ties into the places you've come from, the things that matter to you. Maybe it ties into the people that you've noted in your tree. And we couldn't pass by a moment of using the word ground without reminding us to ground ourselves. And I know Trish will get us back to butterfly breathing in a moment. So perhaps you can even hold that thought. So if we had more time, part of what happens in this activity is that there is an opportunity for reflection. You step back, kind of look at the tree as a whole, and see what starts to come at you, themes, ideas, maybe new insights that come to you as you start to see the connections on your tree. But then there's also the group sharing. And that is, again, the forest where we start to bring the community together. And there'll be some things which, if you have a classroom full of students, let's say, I know someone in the comments said, hey, I'm chiming in from Virginia. So if you get a class full of students who are born and raised in Virginia, it's probably going to be some commonalities in terms of where it would come from. And so that's an easy one. That is low-hanging fruit on these trees. But maybe there are some other unexpected and interesting, surprising connections too that folks start to make by sharing. And then there's also just the awe-inspiring experience of sharing something that you've created, something that's meaningful to you in such a deep way. With extra time, there are extra options. For today, I'm just gonna acknowledge that you can take any one or all of the 4 options on this list. You can make up your own. This number 4, the compost pile, that was never originally part of the Tree of Life, but somebody who was doing the work said, you know, this person, I think it might have been an ex-spouse, you know, they've impacted me, that's significant, but I don't want them in my tree anymore. What can I do with that? And, you know, the creativity allowed for the wisdom to say, how about we create a compost pile sort of next to the tree? And you put those things there. So again, you'll have these slides. You can dig into the steps that we have shared, as well as the original creators link. And then if you want to see the Earth Day project that our Ukrainian colleagues did, at the bottom of this slide here, there is a full half hour of slides of the trees, different people from this presentation here, as well as Ukrainian colleagues who discuss the project in depth. So hopefully, if you have written things down, that's been useful. If you've just been sort of thinking as we've been doing this, maybe you've been transported someplace and connected to something that maybe makes you smile or perhaps inspires a sense of awe. But as was mentioned, trees, forests, it's part of an ecosystem. So we'll talk about that at the moment.
So this is like I think our own ecosystem feeling. And when we work with others, like in Ukraine, we feel like we've developed an ecosystem feeling together collaboratively. And for example, you can see a huge tree on the right in this growing forest jungle, and there are roots, and all the trees are connected in some way. And you can see a flower in the center. We did flower of well-being activity that is based in understanding what influences your well-being. So each petal is like economically, let's say, what influences your well-being for those in Ukraine, spiritually and more. And other activities were like animal yoga, like Trish was talking about. You're probably, some of you are familiar with PATHS program, where Tucker Turtle, we shared that, where you go into tuck yourself in your shell for a moment when you're upset, and you count to 3 as a child in a classroom, and then you come out and you're in a different place. A carousel way of learning in the classroom was introduced, where you have different spots in the classroom that you go to for learning that engage you in different ways to help with engagement because of some of the cognitive impact of trauma that Trish was talking about, and of course the butterfly. Now you may wonder, what's this tapir fox and squirrel doing in here? And those are our personal spirit animals. Chose the fox. That's sort of part of our, I guess, our own thinking of community, collective effervescence, and healing. Trish is the squirrel, and I'm the tapir. And so you think about like, how does this reflect on you and your connection and our connection with each other in this ecosystem of healing?
If you don't know what a tapir is, you might want to look it up, because I had no idea what that was when Colleen said, "Oh, that's me." I'm like, okay, I don't know that one. One thing we've done with kiddos is we introduce some animal yoga poses that they can do in a classroom, and we do this here in the States, and they do it throughout Ukraine now. And they start with poses we offer, and then they create their own animals in their own poses, and then share that awe and joy with each other. And I'm going to, in our next meeting with Ukraine on, what's today? Today's Sunday. Wednesday, I'm going to offer up the tapir and see what they come up with, if they know what that is. We're going to invite you to really consider this idea of an ecosystem of healing in the environment that you're in. So when you think of an ecosystem, there's a micro of what's directly around you or around the child that you work with. Then there's different layers as you go beyond that out to an exosystem, macro system. So creating what's directly around. And that's through words, it's through visuals, it's through music, it's through engaging that whole neurodevelopmental system for that whole child, as you think of being in a classroom where kids have experienced trauma of various levels and at different ages. And one thing that we have found, and that our folks in Ukraine talk about, and that each of us notice in our work that we do in other elements, is the criticalness of predictability around routines. And that is something that we always start. Joe always starts our meetings with welcome, dobry day, welcome in Ukrainian. And we are grateful for this opportunity to come beside you. We use it in, kids are using it to have a consistent way to transition, whether it's from one class to another, from a shelter back to the classroom. There's always a consistency that you can provide in how they transition, so that ecosystem of healing is predictable. And then how you say goodbye. And one thing we have worked with the folks in Ukraine, and we work in each of our elements, is how to create a regulation of your central nervous system to up or down regulate it depending upon what's happening for you. And a butterfly is a beautiful analogy, particularly for kids, because they can then create all kinds of stories of where they want their butterfly to go. And the butterfly analogy brings that whole neural system into context depending upon how much you want to do with the idea. But a visualization is, you imagine your wings are like those of a butterfly. And as your wings start down by your sides and you move them up, you're taking a breath in. And then as you exhale, you're pushing your arms down and you're visualizing and feeling that breath push back out of you. So I'd like to invite you to join us in our goodbye with each other. And after we do this, we'll take questions. But in closing, thinking about when you leave your kids at the end of the day, when you leave the ecosystem that you are in and those around you, how do you leave it well? And how do you leave it in thinking about those developmental systems we talked about and the different ways of creating awe and beauty? And so I'd like you to take a deep breath in. And as you sit in your chair, put your feet firmly on the ground. Take a deep breath in with wings up. And hold it. And breathe out. Take a deep breath in with wings up. Hold it and push it out slower than you inhaled. So push out to the count of 5. Breathe in to the count of 4. Hold it. Down-regulate your system by breathing out to the count of 5. Push down your wings. As you continue to breathe, put your feet firmly on the ground. Wiggle your toes. Visualize your feet as part of the trees in a root, the rooted system that's part of a forest that connects us within our ecosystem and across the globe, with branches that the butterfly can travel to. Take a deep breath in and out, and in and out. Know you are not alone. Know you are loved. You matter. You belong. We are connected. Peace be with you. Peace be with your families. Peace be with the children and those you come encounter with. Peace be with Ukraine and all the war-torn countries right now and around the world. You are not alone. That's an example of how we end every meeting with Ukraine.
Thank you, Trish. And we'll be ending our meeting momentarily. I want to point out to you here, you'll get these slides so you have our contact info. In fact, I think you have other ways of accessing it. So that's there. It's almost 6. We're happy to stick around and have Q&A. If people want to hang around for a few minutes afterwards, that's great. And if you do have to go, we invite you to ponder these points here. We're happy to discuss them with you if you want to stick around, or we leave those with you. So thank you for your attention and your time, and we are open to the group. Thank you, Carrie, for your comment there. That it's impossible to separate sort of the politics and the geolocation from the work that we do. Glad it was helpful.
I'll just notice if there's anything else while we're waiting. Feel free to reach out to any of us for how we've implemented any of these in the work that we're doing, any of these ideas, and more detail in Ukraine across the different age ranges and skill set abilities. So depending upon what type of class you're working in, we can give you examples.
So we're just about at 6. Perhaps this is a time to say thank you and have a wonderful, I was going to say rest of your evening. I know certain folks such as Colleen are just starting their day. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you are well met, and we thank you.